On her wedding night, he gave her a locket, not of love but of loss, and it became the test that would change them both forever. The church at the edge of Dry Creek looked as though it had been standing since the world was young, its white paint long stripped by wind, its bell silent, its steps sagging beneath the weight of too many goodbyes. Inside, the air smelled of pine sap, candle wax, and dust. The pews were half filled with faces Clara Bell barely recognized. Townsfolk come more for gossip than blessing. She stood at the front, her fingers twisting the hem of her plain cotton dress, the one her mother had sewn by lantern light. It wasn't fine lace or satin, just white calico softened by washing and the faint scent of lavender she'd hidden inside the seams. Her braid hung heavy down her back, tied with a ribbon that had once been sky blue but now looked the color of old smoke. Across from her stood Eli Morgan, a man carved by the land itself. His hands were rough, his shoulders broad, his eyes unreadable beneath the shadow of his hat. A widower, they said. A quiet man who worked hard and spoke little. Clara could feel the stillness around him like a wall. The preacher's words floated over her. Vows about honor and obedience, love and faith, though love was the one word that hung uncertain in the air. Eli's voice was low when he spoke his part. Hers trembled. When the ring slipped onto her finger, a small band of dull gold, she felt the weight of it more than the shine. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves around the churchyard as they climbed into the wagon. The few guests offered half-hearted waves, already turning back toward their own small lives. Her mother's eyes were red, her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Clara wanted to reach for her, to stay just a little longer, but the wagon lurched forward before she could. The road west stretched lonely beneath a sky the color of iron. They rode in silence, the wheels creaking, the wind tugging at her veil until it caught on a sage bush and tore free. Eli didn't stop to retrieve it. Clara watched it vanish in the dust behind them, a white scrap swallowed by the wind, and for reasons she couldn't name, she felt as though she had just buried something. Hours passed before the shape of Eli's land rose out of the plain. A weathered cabin crouched against the hills, a barn slanted like a tired old man, and fields gone to brittle stalks. Fences sagged, the well bucket leaned askew, yet even in decay the place breathed a kind of stubbornness. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand warm but brief on hers. "It ain't much," he said quietly, his first words since the ceremony. "But it'll hold." Inside, the cabin smelled of old timber and tobacco smoke. One table, 2 chairs, a cold hearth and a single iron bed pushed against the wall. On the mantel, a woman's comb carved from bone still lay beside a dried bouquet of prairie flowers. Clara traced her fingers along the wood of the doorframe, the marks of height scratched in uneven lines. Initials beside them, MM. She turned to Eli, but he was already outside unhitching the horse. She unpacked in silence, folding her dress, smoothing the thin blanket over the bed. The quiet pressed around her like snowfall. When he came in again, night had already gathered over the valley. He set his hat on the table, nodded toward the bed, and without a word placed a small wooden box upon the folded quilt. "For you," he said. Then he left. The sound of the door closing felt final, like the turning of a key. Clara sat down on the bed and looked at the box. It was simple pine, the lid carved with a faint pattern, a pair of initials worn by time. The latch was stiff, but it opened with a soft click. Inside, a thin silver chain glimmered in the lamplight. A locket, oval, smooth, and heavy. When she opened it, she found a photograph of a young woman with gentle eyes and a braid of pale hair draped over one shoulder. A small curl of that same hair was pressed inside, bound with faded blue ribbon. The lamplight flickered. For a long while, Clara sat still, the locket trembling between her fingers. She knew what it meant. Not a keepsake for her, but a relic of another. A memory too precious to bury, yet too painful to keep close. Through the thin cabin walls, she could hear Eli moving outside, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur of a horse. His voice carried softly through the night, not speaking to her, but to someone long gone. She closed the locket and set it gently back in the box. The wind rose again, rattling the windows. The first stars emerged above the plains, cold and far. Clara lay on the bed, still in her wedding dress, the scent of lavender now drowned by dust and wood smoke. She stared at the ceiling and listened to the night breathe around her. This was her new home. a house of echoes, where every board seemed to whisper another woman's name. And as the fire in the hearth guttered to embers, she realized with a chill that her husband's first gift was not a token of affection, but a question, a test she did not yet understand. Morning on the Morgan ranch came slow and colorless, the kind of dawn that crept rather than rose. The air was brittle with frost, and Clara woke to the sound of the wind scraping against the shutters. The cabin still smelled of smoke from last night's fire, its ashes dull and gray. Eli was already gone. She could see the faint tracks of his boots in the dirt outside leading toward the barn. Her days began to take shape without words. She fed the hens behind the cabin, scattering the grain with her shawl pulled tight against the chill. She carried water from the well, her fingers numb around the iron handle. When the chores were done, she sat by the window with her sewing, mending Eli's shirts, patching his coat, darning socks she'd never see him wear. He slept in the barn most nights, leaving her alone in the cabin with the fire and her thoughts. Eli's silence was not cruel, but it was heavy, a silence that did not push her away yet did not let her in either. Sometimes she heard him singing low to his horse or talking to himself in the dark, words carried away by the wind. Days bled into one another, each marked only by the chores and the setting sun. The land stretched endlessly, brown grass, crooked fences, a river that shimmered like steel beyond the fields. At night, when she stepped outside, the sky looked close enough to touch, the stars bright and pitiless. It was on such a morning, when the air smelled faintly of thawing earth, that she found the shawl. She had been cleaning the trunk at the foot of the bed, one she had avoided since her wedding night. Beneath folded linens and an old quilt lay a piece of fabric, soft and faded, a woman's shawl of dark wool, the fringe torn, a small tear near the edge stitched with careful, clumsy thread. She lifted it to her face. It smelled faintly of wild sage and something she couldn't name, like rain that had fallen long ago. That evening, while fetching eggs from the coop, she saw a figure on the trail, a stout woman with a bonnet tied tight under her chin. It was Mrs. Crane, the widow who lived a few miles east. She had a knack for talk and a hunger for it too. "Well now, you must be the new Mrs. Morgan," the woman said, eyes bright with curiosity. "I didn't think Eli would ever marry again after—" "Well, after what happened," Clara blinked. "After what?" Mrs. Crane hesitated, her voice lowering as if the prairie itself might be listening. "Didn't he tell you? About Mary?" The name dropped like a stone. Clara said nothing. "They said she drowned," the woman whispered. "River took her in the spring floods. Some say it was an accident. Others, well, they say a woman doesn't walk to the river alone unless she means to." She sighed, shaking her head. "Eli's been different ever since. Keeps to himself. Doesn't take kindly to talk of it." The widow gave a small nod of sympathy that felt more like curiosity disguised. Then she left, her wagon disappearing in a cloud of dust. That night, Clara sat by the fire with the shawl in her lap. The flames threw long shadows across the walls, twisting and curling like smoke made of memory. She opened the small wooden box again. The locket gleamed faintly in the firelight. The woman's face stared back at her, calm and unafraid. Mary. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the loose boards of the barn. Clara's chest tightened. She wondered if Eli had ever given this shawl, this locket, as gifts, tokens of affection or perhaps of remembrance. And if she, standing now in Mary's place, was meant to carry those tokens until they broke her. When she finally slept, her dreams came dark and cold. She was standing by the river, her skirt heavy with water, the current tugging at her ankles. A braid of pale hair floated beside her, twisting in the current like a living thing. She reached for it, but the water pulled it away. Somewhere in the distance, someone called her name. Soft at first, then fading into the sound of rushing water. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, the dream still clinging like mist. Rain was falling, soft but steady, tapping against the window. She rose, wrapped the shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The sky hung low and gray. The earth smelled alive again, raw and clean. Across the yard, she saw Eli standing near the edge of the field, his coat dark with rain, his face turned toward the river. He stood there unmoving, hat in hand, as if listening for something she could not hear. For a long moment, Clara watched him. The distance between them felt as wide as the land itself, filled with ghosts, half-spoken words, and a sorrow she did not yet understand. She turned back toward the house, The shawl clutched close, and as the door creaked shut behind her, she felt the truth press in around her like the damp air. The locket had never been a token of welcome. It was a measure, a test to see whether she could live beneath the roof of the dead and not be swallowed by their memory. In that moment, Clara realized this was not merely a house. It was a house of echoes, and every echo carried another woman's name. Winter came to the valley like a long-held breath, cold, sharp, and merciless. The sky stayed white for days, the kind of white that swallowed color and sound alike. The river froze at its edges, the fences creaked beneath the weight of frost, and the cabin seemed to shrink under the wind's unending howl. Clara moved through the season in silence. She tended the hearth as if it were a fragile living thing, coaxing flame from damp wood, guarding every spark like hope itself. Her hands cracked and bled from the cold, but she didn't complain. Eli worked from dawn until dusk, fighting to save the last of his crops, chopping wood, patching fences no one else would see until spring. Sometimes, when he came in after dark, snow crusted in his beard and shoulders, she would have coffee waiting. He'd take it with a nod, sit by the fire without speaking, and stare into the flames as though they might give him back something he'd lost. They spoke little, but the silence between them had begun to change, less like a wall, more like a wound that might one day heal. Clara had learned to read the quiet gestures, the extra log he placed on the fire before stepping out, the way he set his hat gently on the hook by the door instead of tossing it aside. Still, there were nights when she felt him retreat again, when the wind rose and his eyes grew distant, fixed on some memory she could never reach. It was on one such evening that the locket slipped from her fingers. She had been wiping the table when the chain caught on her sleeve. The small silver oval fell, struck the floorboards, and cracked open. The sound was small, but it echoed like thunder. Inside, the photograph had split down the middle. The curl of pale hair scattered across the floor like snow. Clara froze. Her hands trembled as she knelt, gathering the pieces, her breath shallow. She didn't hear Eli enter until his boots stopped behind her. "What did you do?" His voice was low, but it carried the weight of years. It slipped," she said, holding out the locket. "I didn't mean—" He took it from her hand. For a heartbeat, he only stared at it. Then something in him broke. He slammed the box against the wall, the wood splintering. "You had no right," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You don't touch what you don't understand." Clara stepped back, her heart pounding. The firelight threw his shadow across the walls in a dark, trembling shape. "It was an accident," she whispered, but the words sounded small against the storm of his grief. Eli's face twisted, anger, sorrow, and guilt tangled into one. He turned, grabbed his coat, and stormed out into the snow, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the windows. The night stretched long. Clara sat by the fire, listening to the wind clawing at the roof. Each gust made the cabin shudder, but she did not move. She stared at the scattered fragments of the locket and wondered if she had just broken something far more fragile than metal. Hours passed before she heard the door creak again. Eli stood there covered in snow, his breath white in the lamplight. He held a bottle in one hand, his knuckles raw and bleeding. Without a word, he crossed the room, sat by the fire, and poured himself a drink. The smell of whiskey mixed with smoke. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire hissed. Outside, the wolves howled, long, mournful cries that carried across the frozen valley. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "That locket, it wasn't meant to hurt you." He stared into the flames. "It was meant as proof, to see if you'd run." Clara turned slowly toward him. "Proof of what?" "That you weren't like her." He rubbed his face with a shaking hand. "Mary was kind, but the land took her piece by piece. The floods, the drought, the winters that wouldn't end. When she went to the river, I thought she was fetching water, but she never came back. This land remembers her better than I do." His voice cracked. "I wanted to see if it'd break you, too." The words sank into the quiet like stones. Clara's throat tightened, not with fear, but with understanding. She saw then that Eli's fury wasn't born from cruelty. It was born from terror. The fear of losing someone again, of watching another heart fade under the weight of his silence. She stood, her knees trembling. "You wanted to see if I'd run," she said softly. "Well, I haven't." Eli looked up. His eyes, usually hard as iron, were wet in the firelight. "I'm not her," Clara whispered, "but I'll not run from ghosts." The wind rose outside, sweeping snow against the windows like handfuls of salt. Eli's hand dropped the bottle, letting it roll across the floor. He covered his face, shoulders shaking once. A soundless tremor of release, half a sob, half a breath. Clara stepped closer, then stopped, uncertain. The fire popped, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. She watched him for a long moment, her heart still aching but not afraid. This was the test. Not of obedience, not of endurance, but of spirit. To live among ghosts without letting them devour her. She turned toward the hearth and fed another log to the flame. The fire roared up, bright and alive. Shadows fled to the corners. Eli stayed seated, silent. But something in his posture softened, not forgiveness. Not peace, but the fragile beginning of both, outside. The wolves cried again, but this time, the sound felt distant, smaller somehow, as if even the night had grown weary of mourning. And when Clara looked once more at the broken locket lying on the floor, she didn't feel shame or sorrow. She only felt the truth of it, that some things must shatter before they can be laid to rest. Spring came late that year, slow and uncertain, as though the earth itself was afraid to breathe again. The snow melted in hesitant trickles, gathering into rivulets that wound through the fields and fed the swollen river. The air smelled of wet soil and thawing pine, and for the first time in months, the sound of birds carried through the valley like fragile promises. Clara stood on the porch one morning, watching the light creep across the land. The sky was a pale wash of blue, the kind that belonged more to dreams than to daylight. Her hands were raw from work, her hair loose from the morning wind. Somewhere beyond the hills, Eli was mending fences, his figure small against the expanse of reborn earth. It was the river that drew her that day, not by decision, but by something older than thought. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and followed the path through the greening field, her boots sinking into the damp soil. The river ran faster now, alive and restless, its voice a low, ceaseless whisper. She stopped at the bend where the willows leaned low, their branches brushing the current. The air was cool and full of scent, water, moss, and the faint sweetness of wild sage. She knelt near the bank, and as she did, something half buried in the mud caught her eye. A small wooden horse, its paint worn and one leg missing. She brushed the dirt away gently. It looked like a toy, the kind a child might have once carried in her pocket. Farther down the bank, tangled in a cluster of reeds, a strand of pale hair clung to a branch. It shimmered faintly in the light, ghost-like and delicate. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't touch it, only stared, her breath shallow. It felt as though the land itself was offering up the remnants of its grief. When she returned to the cabin, she sat before the small mirror and began to braid her hair. Her fingers moved slowly, deliberately. The braid was uneven, but it felt right. A gesture not of imitation, but of understanding. Every morning after that, she did the same. The braid became her quiet defiance, her way of speaking to the past without words. Eli noticed. He said nothing at first, but she saw his gaze linger when she passed him coffee or hung linens to dry. His silence had softened since the storm, though it still carried the weight of old wounds. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon and the air turned cool, she walked again to the river. The water glowed with the colors of fire and ash. Eli followed, his steps slow, deliberate, the sound of his boots on the damp earth breaking the hush. He stopped beside her, hands in his coat pockets, eyes fixed on the current. For a long while, neither spoke. The river did all the talking, endless, restless, alive. Finally, Eli's voice came low. "You've been coming here often?" "Yes," Clara said softly. "It feels awake here." He nodded, still staring at the water. "Mary used to come here too, every day after the work was done." His voice trembled slightly. She said it made her feel less alone. The last light of day caught the side of his face, lined, worn, and still burdened by something too heavy for one man to carry. "Eli," Clara said quietly, "tell me what really happened." He was silent for a long moment, the muscles in his jaw tight. Then he exhaled, as if he had been holding that breath for years. "It wasn't the river that took her," he said finally. "It was me, not with my hands, but with my silence." Clara turned toward him, he went on, voice hoarse. "The drought came 3 years in a row. The cattle died first, then the crops. Mary stopped singing. Stopped speaking. She'd stand by the window for hours just staring out at the dust. I tried to keep the ranch alive, but I couldn't see what it was doing to her. And one morning, he swallowed hard. I found her bonnet near the river. That was all. He looked down, shoulders bowed as though under invisible weight. People called it an accident. I let them. But I knew better, and I've been living with it ever since. The river moved between them, dark and alive. Clara felt the wind lift the ends of her braid and scatter them across her shoulder. For a moment she thought of Mary, her face in the locket, her shawl folded in the trunk, her laughter perhaps once echoing through these same fields. She imagined her standing here barefoot at the river's edge, weary of silence and loss. Without speaking, Clara reached out and took Eli's hand. His fingers were cold, calloused, trembling. He didn't look at her, but his hand tightened around hers, hesitant at first, then steady. It was not forgiveness she gave him, nor did he ask for it. It was something quieter, recognition. The acknowledgement of shared suffering, of two souls bound not by passion but by endurance. The river whispered on, indifferent and eternal. The sky above deepened into indigo. Across the far hills, a meadowlark began to sing. Eli finally spoke, his voice a thread. "I thought this land was cursed," he said, "that it took everything good and gave nothing back." Clara looked toward the fading light. "Maybe it's not cursed," she said softly. "Maybe it's just waiting for us to listen." They stood together until the last light faded. Their reflections caught side by side in the water's restless surface. Not husband and wife yet. Not strangers anymore, but something in between. When they walked back to the cabin, the stars were already burning above the valley. Clara felt the weight of her braid against her neck, a quiet promise that not all things that break are meant to end. Some, like rivers, keep flowing, carrying what was lost toward what might still be found. The rain began softly that morning, a gentle patter on the roof, a whisper through the pines. By noon it had become a steady roar. The sky hung low and gray, the air thick with the scent of wet earth. The river, once calm and silver, churned brown and wild beneath the storm. For a week it had rained without rest. The fields that had only just begun to green were now drowning under water. The fences leaned sagging in the mud. The cattle bellowed restlessly in the lower pasture, their cries carried away by the wind. Every sound, the creak of wood, the slam of shutters, and seemed part of something larger and more menacing. Clara stood by the window, her hands gripping the sill. Beyond the glass, the valley was unrecognizable, a blur of rain and shadow. "It won't hold much longer," Eli said behind her, pulling on his coat. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed the same fear that clawed at her chest. "You can't go out there," she said. "The river's too high," he met her gaze. "If the herd swept off, we lose everything. I'll be back before dark." Before she could stop him, he opened the door. The wind tore it from his grasp, slamming it wide. Rain lashed through the opening, cold and merciless. Then he was gone, swallowed by the gray. Hours passed. The light dimmed to a bruised twilight. Clara fed the fire, paced the cabin, listened to the endless roar outside. The roof dripped in corners. Water pooled beneath the door. Her braid clung to her neck, damp from the leaking walls. When the last trace of daylight vanished, something inside her snapped. She couldn't wait any longer. Eli was out there, somewhere near the river, the same cursed place that had taken Mary. A tremor ran through her hands, but she didn't hesitate. She lit the lantern, shielding its flicker from the draft, and threw on her cloak. The moment she stepped outside, the storm hit her full force. Wind howled through the trees, rain slicing across her face like needles. The ground was a pit of mud. Every step was a battle. She led the horse from the stable, whispering to calm its trembling. Lightning flared, illuminating the valley in blinding flashes. Fences shattered, trees uprooted, the river swollen beyond its banks. She mounted and rode into the chaos. The lantern swung wildly from her hand, its light cutting brief paths through the darkness. Thunder rolled across the sky, so close it felt like the earth itself was splitting apart. At the ridge above the river, she called out, her voice raw against the wind. "Eli, no answer!" Only the relentless roar of water. She pressed on, following the faint glimmer of the river's surface below. The path had vanished underwater. The horse stumbled, nearly unseating her. She dismounted and led it on foot, the water rising to her knees, then her thighs. And then she saw him. He was lying near the riverbank, half submerged, a fallen branch pinning him to the mud. The lantern's light caught his face, pale, streaked with blood. His horse was nowhere in sight. Eli! She dropped to her knees beside him, the cold biting into her bones. His eyes flickered open, dazed. Clara, you shouldn't... Don't you dare say that, she hissed through her tears. She pushed against the branch, but it wouldn't budge. The current tore at her skirt, the river threatening to pull them both under. She braced herself and tried again, muscles screaming. Come on! With a final cry, she rolled the branch aside. Eli gasped, dragging in a breath that sounded more like a sob. Clara looped her arm under his and pulled. Inch by inch, she dragged him from the bank, through the rising water toward the faint light of home. It felt endless, mud sucking at her boots, rain blinding her eyes, the lantern sputtering and dying. More than once she stumbled, nearly falling, but she kept going. Every step was an act of will, every breath a battle. By the time they reached the cabin, she was shaking from exhaustion. She pushed the door open with her shoulder and half-carried, half-dragged him inside. The fire had nearly died. She threw on more wood until the flames leapt high again. Eli collapsed by the hearth, coughing. His face was ghost-white, his clothes soaked and torn. Clara worked wordlessly, cutting his shirt away, cleaning the gash on his arm, wrapping it with what linen she had left. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. When she finally sat back, her breath came in ragged bursts. Eli's eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, truly looked, as though seeing her for the first time. You came for me, he whispered. Clara met his gaze. Did you think I wouldn't? He swallowed hard, his eyes shining with something between shame and awe. I thought you'd run, like everyone else did. She shook her head, her braid heavy with rainwater. You gave me a locket that held death, she said softly. I'll give you a life that still breathes. The fire crackled. Rain drummed on the roof like a heartbeat. Outside, the storm still raged, but within those walls something had shifted. The silence between them had broken. Eli's hand found hers. It was weak, trembling, but warm. He closed his fingers around her wrist as if anchoring himself to the only solid thing left in the world. I thought the river wanted me, he murmured. Maybe it just wanted to test me. Clara smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. Then let it know we passed. He tried to speak again, but the words failed him. She hushed him gently, pressing a damp cloth to his brow. The firelight cast soft gold across the walls, catching the droplets still clinging to her braid. Outside, the river roared, wild, endless, alive. But inside the cabin, the storm had met its match. Two broken souls sat by the fire, bound not by grief but by the fragile courage it takes to keep breathing when the world asks you not to. When dawn came, the rain finally ceased. Mist drifted through the valley like ghosts retreating into the trees. The river still ran high, but its fury had softened. Eli slept, his face peaceful at last. Clara sat beside him, lantern flickering low, her eyes on the window where the first pale light of morning crept in. She whispered into the quiet, more to herself than to him. We made it through the flood, and for the first time she believed it. Spring returned as if it had been waiting for them. The valley that winter had nearly drowned now shimmered under a soft green veil. Wildflowers pushed through the blackened soil. The cottonwoods along the river unfurled their silver leaves, trembling in the morning wind. And the air, the same air that had once smelled of smoke and sorrow, now carried the scent of rain-washed grass and distant lilacs. Clara stood in the yard, a basket of clean linens balanced on her hip. She hummed as she worked, pinning the white sheets to the line. They flapped like sails in the breeze, catching sunlight that danced through the trees. Each flutter was a small joy, a sign that the house, their house, had finally learned to breathe again. Behind her, Eli moved slowly along the corral fence, hammer in hand. His limp was still there, a reminder of the night the river tried to take him. But he carried it without complaint. Each swing of the hammer was steady, measured, not the motion of a man punishing himself, but of one mending what could be mended. The days had settled into a quiet rhythm. Morning coffee shared on the porch, work in the fields until the heat set in, supper by lamplight, with the sound of crickets through the open window. There was still silence between them sometimes, but it no longer felt like emptiness, only the calm that follows a long storm. Inside the cabin, the mantel held 2 photographs. The old one, the worn, faded image of Mary, had been moved into a small wooden frame and placed beside the new one. Clara and Eli, standing side by side before a traveling photographer's wagon. The image captured more than faces. It captured survival. Eli's eyes, once hard as stone, now held a trace of something gentler. Clara's hands were clasped in front of her, steady and sure. When visitors passed through the valley, traders, riders, sometimes a lost drifter, they spoke quietly of the Morgans. Some said they had seen death and found peace. Others whispered that the river had tested them and, finding them worthy, had finally given them back their land. That morning, the air was golden and warm. Clara poured coffee into 2 tin cups and brought one to the porch. She sat in the rocking chair, the wood creaking softly beneath her. Her braid, still long but streaked now with sun, brushed her shoulder as she leaned back and watched the horizon. The fields were alive again, rippling like green water. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang. Eli joined her a few minutes later. He had washed his hands, but the scent of cedar and oil still clung to him. He lowered himself into the chair beside hers with a quiet grunt and took his coffee. For a long moment they said nothing, only watched the sunlight spill over the hills. Clara smiled faintly. "The river's calm today," Eli nodded. "Has been for weeks." He took a sip, then set his cup down. "You ever think about leaving this place?" She shook her head. "No, the land remembers same as we do. But it's not cruel anymore." He looked at her then, the lines around his eyes softening. "No," he said, "it's not." After a moment, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. It was the same size as the one he had given her months ago, the one that had changed everything. He turned it in his rough hands as if weighing the past before offering it forward. Clara's breath caught. "Another gift?" she asked, her voice teasing but touched with something tender. "Something like that." He placed it in her lap. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a new locket, plain silver, unpolished, the kind that carried both promise and memory. But when she opened it, it was empty. She looked up at him, puzzled. "There's nothing inside." Eli's gaze held hers steady. "So you can fill it yourself," he said softly. For a long time she couldn't speak. The sunlight glinted off the locket and she saw her own reflection. Not the frightened girl in a dusty wedding dress, not the lonely wife haunted by another woman's shadow, but a woman who had endured the flood and come out shining. Her throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He reached out, brushing his thumb against her hand. "So are you, Clara Bell." Her eyes filled, tears bright as morning dew. She smiled through them, laughing softly, the sound as clear as the wind through the grass. The world seemed to exhale around them, the creak of the porch boards, the slow rocking of the chairs, the gentle hum of bees in the distance. She clasped the locket shut and held it to her chest. "I think," she said, "this is the kind of gift a person waits their whole life to deserve." Eli said nothing. He only leaned back, eyes closed, the faintest smile on his lips. The sun climbed higher, gilding the fields, the roof, the edges of the river beyond. The ghosts that had once lingered in the corners of the house now drifted harmlessly through the open doorways. Not banished, but at peace. Clara rocked gently, the cup warm in her hand, her heart even warmer. The world was still imperfect, scarred, unpredictable, but it was alive. And so were they. The morning light deepened golden and wide. The locket glimmered against her throat, catching the sun like a promise kept.